And it's good to see everybody once again. Thank you for the hospitality and for the questions and the interest in our topic. It's just tremendous being able to share God's creation, His messages, and come right out into the Word of God and be fed. There really is that experience, and it's a wonderful. Just a wonderful experience for me every time I teach it. I never get tired of it, and I sure appreciate the questions because I love talking about it. I just had a question asked out here a little earlier before we started, and we got into quantum foam of the vacuum and space of nothing, and it sounds silly, but these really are very important things. I was doing a presentation at the University of Arkansas. We were set up in the engineering building, and one of the physics professors there, who is a hardcore, belligerent atheist, he was in the audience, and he was heckling. And I always have the dirty dozen that follows me around in that area. If I'm speaking, they always show up. And Dr. Harder was there. He's a particle physicist, which means he deals in quantum mechanics and quantum physics of explaining the universe. And he was cited as an authority by another atheist who I was in a debate with, a philosophy professor, as something can come out of nothing, and we have the evidence for that. I said, well, what is the evidence for that? Well, a reliable source. Well, they didn't want to share that reliable source. I had to ask many, many times. Finally pinned it down, came down to Dr. Harder. I called Dr. Harder and I said, Dr. Harder, so-and-so is referencing you as the authority that something can come out of nothing. He says, oh, yes, yes, yes. And I said, well, what are you referring to? What's the evidence for that? Oh, that was back in the 1960s, and he starts going on about the vacuum chamber. And I don't know if any of you have heard of the vacuum chamber where something came out of nothing, supposedly. Actually, it was just the conversion of one form of energy into another form of energy. And that's what I pointed out. Well, Dr. Harder, I'm familiar with that experiment. That wasn't something coming out of nothing. And I can still hear him sputtering and him hawing on the other end of the phone, go, yeah, well, yeah. I'll tell you what, these guys, no matter what level of education they are or where they're teaching or expertise they have, they are bald-faced liars. They are not ashamed to lie. This is one of the challenges we are faced with. And it requires that we do know something. At least we can, catch them in their lies. But on the other hand, if they believe their lies, then what do you do? That's even tougher. So we do have our work cut out for us. This evening, we're going to start talking about creation evangelism and the need for creation in our evangelism. Creation evangelism. What is that? Well, that's how we connect with people who are interested in this subject. Not everyone is interested in this subject. People might be interested in and find it fascinating, but and some people just, well, yeah, okay, God created it. I don't need to know anymore. But we live in a day and age where creationism is absolutely critical to the survival of our faith. And what I mean by that, we know that the Lord said that His church will not perish. We'll be here till the end of the world. But I will tell you this, that there's a lot that we're going downhill. And even as the Lord said, will there be faith when I return? The big question mark there is, how many people are still hanging on? How many people? The Lord didn't say how many churches are still going to be around. We are faced with a great, great crisis, and our churches feel it. With our young with our youth. They grow up in our churches. We love them. We care for them. We teach them. They go into the college. They go into the community. They go out on the internet. They find out all these wonderful questions and criticisms of the Bible, and then they're looking for answers and they can't find them. That was my testimony this morning. I don't know where I would be today if the internet was available back when I was in high school. That is serving a diabolical and deadly purpose. I had a woman from Texas call me and ask me if I would talk to her son, and so I set up a weekly conference with him by phone to talk to him about the issues he was struggling with, trying to answer his questions. I don't know if this kid was unusually intelligent and just smart beyond belief, or if he was sitting there with someone in the car with him. He left the house because he didn't want his mother around when he was talking, and I could only imagine, well, he had someone else, because I felt like I was talking to a college professor. If not, he was on the internet, and what happens is when I talk to people or others talk to people, someone's on the internet and they're fact-checking you and they're bringing this up and that up, and I'm thinking, wow, this kid knows an awful lot for a high schooler. I will give him credit. He understood what he was reading. He wasn't the normal high schooler that I teach there in Fayetteville. I'm a volunteer teacher there for our school. So this internet is very, very dangerous in that there's a lot of information challenging the Christian faith, challenging the veracity of the Bible, challenging the existence of God, challenging the legitimacy of our faith and what we stand for. A lot of criticisms and critiques. This is why it's all the more important that we engage in ministries through the internet. If the churches were not out there, there would be a complete absence, and when people go type in their questions, Google this or that about God, they would only hear one voice, and that would be even worse. I think this past year with COVID was one of the best things that happened, particularly for independent Baptists. I've been involved in internet ministries ever since, even before HTTP came on. I was out there telnetting, and I was out there telnetting from the University of Arkansas. I think the only other group I could find was the University of Michigan and somebody else. There wasn't a whole lot. It was just green screen and text and just, hey, the weather. Look at what's going on over here in the weather. Now we got the World Wide Web, HTTP and HTTPS, if you want to be secure, and we have a wealth of information. It just changed and transformed. The information that's available is not always true, and one of the most important things we can teach people about the internet is how to discern truth from falsehood, and that's not always an easy thing. The popular physicist right now, deGrasse, he said it's a dangerous thing, and one of the biggest dilemmas humanity faces is knowing enough to think you're right, not knowing enough to know you're wrong. That is where we are, and that is such a challenge and dilemma that we face with the internet. There's so much information at your fingertips. You just type it in, you can read or listen to information on the internet. If you're not trained enough, and boy, what does that mean, trained enough? But you can really get sucked into things that are just not true, and you have no clue that you've been duped. And it's just hard to believe, because who of us think that, hey, I'm not dupable. Nobody can fool me. And I'll tell you what, it's happening all the time, and especially with our kids. And we need to be pumping out truth and getting it out there. And that's why I say this past year, there's so much streaming going on, so many sermons, so much information. with the with the challenge of COVID and quarantining, and the churches said, well, I got to do something, so they're getting out on Facebook, and they're streaming through YouTube and other places. That didn't exist over a year ago. Didn't exist prior to COVID, and it's out there now. And there's lots of good stuff out there, and it needs to be out there. There needs to be more. We need to overwhelm the internet with truth. And that might seem rather overwhelming. How could I possibly contribute to that? Well, there are many ways. If you look at my Facebook ministry, Dr. Patrick Briney, what I am doing there is, a year ago I started creating an audience. Facebook told me that I have potential of 2.1 million followers, people who I identify. Now, they're not going to tell me who they are. I have to pay them for that. But they did tell me, you got that many people who are interested in what you're saying. The reason why I'm telling you this is there is an audience out there. My audience is really your audience. And one of the things that I've been trying to teach students is how to use the social media platforms, if they're out there already, and many are. This is how you ought to be using it. You ought to use it as a tool of ministry, as an opportunity to get truth out there. Now, you don't have to get into, hey, I brushed my teeth this morning. Great. That's really something. You brush your teeth. Let's use this as a tool and combat a very insidious enemy. The internet is controlled like a car. It all depends on who's out there and who's driving that car. And we need to get the right people driving that car and overwhelm with truth. Because there are a lot of people who are searching for questions about God and about the Bible. They're searching and they're finding a lot of information that's a lie. It's so insidious that if you start, and I do this, if you start looking for creation, Bible and religion, Christianity and so on, you will find, not as easily as it was, but some of the top groups at the top of search engines were the atheist groups who were pretending to be Christian. So when you type in and you find that information, you start reading and think, boy, that just doesn't sound quite right. And they are just poisoning the system with their nonsense. Anyway, they go in cloaked as angels of God, but they're devils. And they will camouflage themselves, and many of you are military, and you know that when you start thinking about military strategy, that's exactly what's going on. It's a disinformation campaign, it's a information campaign, it's every kind of campaign you can imagine. We are truly in a warfare. This is not something we can just sit back and ignore. And you don't win a warfare by sitting back being defensive. You're going to get slaughtered. You've got to be prepared, and you need to take some offense. So, without offending. So, and that's part of the challenge too, isn't it? All right, so as I mentioned this morning in my personal testimony, I was looking for answers and they were not available. I had a lot of well-meaning, sincere Christians, as I look back, trying to witness to me. I didn't know what it was back then. I remember one guy sitting with me in front of the library in high school trying to answer my questions. I didn't know what he was doing. I do now, but he was doing his best. I had some great friends who were Christians, and they were trying to reach me. After I became saved, Colleen and I went to church in town, in a Baptist church there in California, and we were sitting there in the congregation, and someone walked up. It was someone we knew from high school. And she said, you are the last person I ever thought would be a Christian. Seeing you in church is just so surprising. Yeah, well, that's because people had tried to witness to me, but it was pretty tough. The only way, I wasn't being belligerent. I wasn't being one of these, Richard Dawkins type guys. I was simply asking a question. Give me a reason to believe, other than, well, just believe. I was looking for something, so I guess some people had written me off. But you see, it's important to have questions, and even more so today than ever before, because we have reasons being given why you shouldn't believe. And the challenges out there that people are facing, or especially our kids, they're getting wiped out. People need to have rational, relevant answers given to them. Rational and relevant. And one of the problems that we have, that we're faced with as churches, even though we know better, we know different, we know we are we could not be more relevant to the needs of the world today. But the world doesn't see that. We are being marginalized. Well, we see that in politics as well. And in politics, more so than ever before, in our lifetime anyway, that we've seen this sort of thing happen if you go through history or you look at other countries. The rhetoric that is spread around, the lies and the combating information that's taking place right now in our politics, that's been around a long time. But today, more than ever in America, in these past about 6 years or so, we've never seen anything more exposed like we've seen it now. The politics is not about truth campaigns, it's about agenda. It's all about agenda. And I sum up politics this way. I'm right, you're wrong. Period. I mean, it's just that simple. If you try to make sense out of what people are saying, you're going to go crazy. It's not, what people say in politics is not about truth and making sense. It's about winning an argument and getting your agenda pushed through. So if you're trying to make sense out of that, I hear radio personalities and other people talk about, that just doesn't make sense. Well, it's not supposed to make sense. It's supposed to persuade. If it sounds good, you've got to vote. That's all you need. It doesn't have to be true. It just has to be persuasive. And that's exactly what's going on in our camps, in our warfare. It doesn't have to be right. It just has to sound right. There's an agenda behind this. We're fighting a spiritual warfare. And there's a lot of church leaders and parents around the world who are asking, why are we losing our youth? Why are we losing our members? Why are we suffering from sin and carnality in the congregation? Why are we having difficulty evangelizing our communities? And we are being viewed as irrelevant. Our message is irrelevant. Not that it is, but it doesn't have to be. It just has to look irrelevant. Someone is persuading, and I say someone. Hey, we live in a culture that is marginalizing and making our message and making God irrelevant, to make people think that way. And irrelevance is the key word. The Bible's discredited as superstitious nonsense. God is discredited as a superstitious creation of ignorant men. That's who God is. That's who we're told. God didn't create man. Man created God. Man is the measure of all things. Came out of Greek philosophy. Now, the Barna group keeps track on the trends in Christianity in our culture and how to think about what is going on. What are people thinking? Why do they think that way? They have published information and data that's excellent information. It gives you a sort of an insight into talking to thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. And you get to see what are the trends in thought, because we are what we think, right? Well, the Barna Trend reports are showing something very interesting, and it shows that the creation evangelism message is very, very, very important and relevant to address our challenges in culture today. We live in a secularized culture. We are post-Christian. We're not a Christian nation. We're running on the momentum of the past at best. We're no longer one nation under God, even though we say we are in our pledges. And we see naturalistic secularism, the momentum of that naturalistic secularism accelerating, and everyday Christianity is becoming more and more marginalized. I mean, that's the trend going on. Barna says, he quotes here, Americans are struggling to determine how faith, Christianity, and church fit into their lives. They don't see any relevance. The Christian community is struggling to remain connected with the next generation of teens and young adults. In particular, the church is losing many young creatives, like designers, artists, writers, musicians, and actors. I love the fact that you got an ensemble. We have an ensemble too, and I picked up on the trumpet. I heard the French horn. I heard all the instruments, but I'm a trumpet player as well, so I picked up on that. And we're losing our medical doctors and our engineers and our biologists and our mathematicians. And what's happening here? Well, we send them off to college and they're getting trained not to believe in God. 84% of Christians 18 to 29 years old admit that they have no idea how the Bible applies to their field or professional interests. The biblical worldview is completely irrelevant to them. Now, if there's no relevance, then there's a disconnect taking place. Another report came out, and they said nearly 3 out of every 5 young Christians, 59%, disconnect either permanently or for an extended period of time from church life after age 15. Now, that's typical across the country here. This is American culture. Kids are saying, some of the quotes and feedback they're getting is, church is ignoring the problems of the real world. So the youth are growing up, they're looking at problems being addressed or whatever the media tells us is important today, and if the church is not addressing that, then the kids are growing up saying, well, our church is not addressing the real problems of the world. Well, we need to be careful allowing the media to dictate our messages and our direction and prioritizing, right? But see, our kids need to hear that as well. He goes on and says, one of the reasons young adults feel disconnected from church or from faith is the tension they feel between Christianity and science. Boy, that is there, isn't it? Yeah. You see, I was in the department there in microbiology at the University of Arkansas, and one of the professors asked me, so how can you be a preacher and a scientist? I mean, how does that work anyway? That doesn't make sense. See, you have to be one or the other because they are diametrically opposed. You can't be both. How does that work? And I've been asked that question by a number of people. You're a preacher and a scientist? Isn't that a contradiction? But you see, that is how people think about science. That it can't be aligned with the Bible. It can't be aligned with God. If you're a scientist, you certainly can't believe in God. You see, that's how far we've come in our culture. And yet, as many of you know, and I know that some of you have already shared this with me in conversation, not that it was the point of your conversation, but I have picked up that you guys have watched some videos and you're reading, you're well studied. Even your kids have made comments that let me know that you're well studied in this information. But we are faced with a culture out here that is not well trained. They're not exposed at all. They're growing up in their churches. They're not discipled, and when they go out into the world, they're slaughtered like lambs to the slaughter, unprepared for what they're about to face. And it says 3 out of 10 young adults with a Christian background feel that churches are out of step with the scientific world we live in. About 25% of them embrace the perception that Christianity is anti-science. And that's unfortunate because God invented science. He invented everything. It ought to come together. There ought not to be a contradiction. In fact, I make the point in some of my other lectures that Christianity is not at odds with science at all. It's at odds with humanism. It's at odds with evolution. But evolution and humanism are philosophies. Those are worldviews. Those are not science. Just because you're a humanist and a scientist doesn't mean that science is humanistic. And so that's one of the things that I point out to people. Yes, I have no problem with science and being a preacher. No problem whatsoever. In fact, it makes me a better scientist. Keeps me honest. So I'm not lying. And I'll tell you, a scientist is just a human. When I was working on my PhD, a story came out of Harvard and some guy had his PhD revoked. Now that's a pretty hard thing to do because you do all that work and how's that going to happen? Well, it turns out he didn't do the work. He fabricated the entire research that he published and claimed, and it turned out as others were investigating and trying to repeat his work, and it's just the way the science works, he got exposed. Yep. He didn't do the work. He was a liar. People are liars. It doesn't matter what profession you're in. Liars are found everywhere. And then another finding here, nearly half of the Christian teenagers surveyed aspire to careers in science, increasing the disconnect. Oh, goodness. Now, the Christian response at large has been, keep our children out of science. Well, man, talk about handing the world over on a silver platter to the enemy. Let's just pull everything out, pull out of everything. Let's pull out of government. Let's pull out of law. Let's pull out of politics. Let's pull out of science. Let's pull out of education and give it over to the devil. That will solve the problems. Oh man, that's a recipe for strategic disaster. No wonder why the Lord said, the children of this world are surely wiser than the children of God. Isn't that a terrible indictment against us? Why are the children of the world so much wiser than us? Well, it's not because of their message. So what is it? What's responsible for the Lord? The Lord said that. Those guys are wiser than us. I think it's strategy. I think if you want to see strategy and what we've been seeing in the last couple of election cycles, go read Saul Alinsky's book, 13 Rules for Radicals. He wrote that in the 1960s. If you want to see it in action and understand what's happening in our world, in our culture here, he lines it up. You'll see every one of those 13 points. And our previous president here is the first president to ever use Saul Alinsky principles on the other side. And I'll tell you what, expose the media like the media has never been exposed before. It's just incredible to watch. These are things that we deal with at our Leadership Training Institute of America. And I was looking forward to the last 2 summers to deal with these things. And we have so much great examples and demonstrations and illustrations. And COVID put our program on hold. We're going to have it this summer. But man, I'll tell you what, there's so much good information to pass on to people about, look what is going on. Saul Alinsky's 13 principles, and you can see, man, they are strategic. And you would think that if God's people in America, in our churches, if we had been doing our job, that the other side should not be taking control of our culture. I mean, we had it in our hands, didn't we? How did we lose it? We were outmaneuvered. that ought not to be. Or do we not have God's wisdom on our side? Well, God didn't fail. If there's a breakdown and Satan's crowd has outmaneuvered us, that tells us one thing. We're not listening to God. We're doing it our own way, and we're losing the battle. And yep, that's why the Lord said, will there be faith when I return? He's just telling us this is how it's going to be. Now, that doesn't mean we have to be that way. That's Christendom at large. We'll blame it on the other guy. Well, they're not doing what they're supposed to do. One of the things I tell the kids, well, the Bible says the days are going to get worse, but that doesn't mean we have to get worse. We'll go down swinging. And we will do what's right no matter what. Somebody has to be the martyr in our culture. And we do have a cause worth dying for, don't we? Now, creation evangelism involves giving answers to questions about creation and evolution, about conflicts between evolution and the Bible, about showing the relevance of biblical truths for today's questions, and about demonstrating that the Bible does describe creation correctly. And people need to hear that because evolution so dominates our education, our public education system, that we've got to be able to counter that. We need to, that's part of evangelism. If kids are being trained in evolution, we've got to be able to answer their questions and show them why that's not true. Well, creation evangelism in part fulfills 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. That admonition that says, but sanctify the Lord God in your hearts and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asks you a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. So I want to share with you an important outline here of what's happening in our culture and expose plainly the significance of the creation-evolution controversy in our culture, as well as to outline the answers that we should be prepared to give. Now, I know that causes some to shake in their boots. People say, there's no way I can do that. I don't even understand what you said. How can I explain it? But you see, part of our ministry and evangelism is to know somebody who can explain it and to pass that on. And there's some great materials. Creation.com is a go-to Australian group, by the way, and they have done a tremendous job. They're great scientists, and they have been publishing information for apologetics. We also have the Answers in Genesis with Ken Ham. I call their ministry sort of the warehouse of creation science. And if you want to find articles about creation science, you can go and find information. Here's how this works in creation evangelism. Just like you can take a study book, and your pastor is known for his volumes of books and just tremendous study aids all over the world. There are creation materials where you can use and teach a Bible study on creationism, on Genesis chapter 1. There are materials available. You can use that. And a lot of that does not involve really tough questions or really deep stuff where I have to be an astrophysicist to talk about this stuff. No, you don't. Anyway, there's some well-prepared materials. Now, here's what's going on. Let me go through this outline, and then what I'm going to do is introduce you to the idea of this is what we're faced with and why it's happening. And then throughout the week, we're going to get into the actual creation science lectures material that I actually deliver at universities and other secular venues. One of the niches I fit as far as creationists is my strength or my focus and emphasis is on creation science, convincing the secularist. There's a lot of guys preaching Bible science, and I do that too. I brought a lesson this morning. But man, we need some creation scientists. We need to, and you got one right here in Washington with Discovery Institute and Jonathan Wells and others who are there in the intelligent design movement. And they're putting out information where they're saying, we're not saying there's a God, we're just saying everything has, the universe appears to be intelligently designed. I'm glad for them. I'm glad that they are out there. I think it's important to have that information. When I go into a classroom and I do a presentation on creation, I'm not opening up the Bible. Because I know from where I was, as soon as I open the Bible, that's going to shut off the mind. I'm not communicating anymore. I'm not connecting. And I'm not saying the Word of God is unimportant. I would never say that. But we take the Word of God as it is to people as they are. And what we're doing in creation evangelism is not only presenting the credibility of the biblical claim that God created, but this also involves giving people a reason to listen. I was given a reason to listen when I talked to Chuck Schwartz. And then he shared the gospel with me, and then I prayed. He had to give me a reason. If he didn't give me a reason to listen, I'm not hearing you. And so we're giving people a reason to listen to the gospel message. Presenting science does not save souls. We got to remember that. It's the gospel of Jesus Christ that saves the soul. Everything we do is towards that end. When we go out and evangelize people, we shake a hand, we smile, we take a meal, we befriend people. We're not saving their souls. But what are we doing? We're building a bridge to communicate. So what? So we can communicate the gospel and win a soul. You see, there's that preparation, isn't it? When you've got the soil, remember the hard soil, four soils, and you got the hard soil, sometimes you got to go out there and start furrowing it and churning it up and helping to soften it up so it'll take the seed. And that's the kind of culture we're in. There is an erosion of the foundation, and and this is how I'm going to introduce tomorrow night's lesson. There's an erosion of our foundation. Psalm chapter 11, verse 3 says, "If the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do?" All right, well, I'm going to show you what the righteous can do and what they must do. The Christian foundation in our culture is coming to an end. It's eroding. Like I said, we are post-Christian. Our country was founded on biblical principles. I know that there is this mass movement of information. Christianity had nothing to do with the founding of America. America is not a Christian nation. And then you have to say, and what are all these towns on the East Coast named after? And what about the God in the Declaration of Independence? And I mean, you see God everywhere. When we take tours through Washington, D.C., you see God. Oh, you see all kinds of gods, yes. But the number one quoted source in all of the original founders' writings is the Bible. The second most quoted source was John Montesquieu, a French philosopher. The third was an English philosopher, John Locke. But the Bible was the most frequently quoted source for authority and guidance in the thinking of our founding fathers in our American culture. We were a Christian nation. Now here's the heart of the problem. Jesus said in Mark chapter 7, verse 6, and I know that's a pretty big statement to make. Here's the heart of the problem. But I already alluded to it earlier. Well hath Isaiah prophesied of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. You see, Christianity at large is very weak and anemic. It says it knows God, but largely Christendom does not know God. And even those who know God are more like maybe the believers at the church at Sardis. They're doing their own thing. They're off doing something else, but they're not focused on what God has for them to do. I find it difficult. Maybe. Well, let me just ask you, do you find it difficult to believe that if Christians early on and continuing to today had done what God had told them to do, to love me with all your heart, soul, and mind, to love others as yourself, likewise, the second command, and to follow and obey Christ, do you think that we would be in the state that we are today? If we had been doing what God told us to do. I don't see how we could be in the state that we're in. After all, we've got God on our side. We've got God's wisdom on our side. How can we be outmaneuvered? How can we be outdone by any opponent if we simply did what God told us to do? And by we, I mean Christendom at large. The ball has been dropped. This people honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. The only reason why we're losing the battle is because we're just paying lip service. We're not doing what God has told us to do. We're not walking in the power of God. We're not demonstrating the power of God. It's just lip service. We're preoccupied with other things. So there's a self-destruction going on. A self-destruction. Now, why do I say that's the heart of the problem? Well, you got Satan, though. You got the lost out here. You got this and that and all of the other things. Are we not told that greater is He? Greater is He that is in me than he that is in the world. If that's true, then how can we possibly lose this war? Satan is not strong enough to destroy us. Even during the most darkest times of persecution, during the Caesars, Christianity was flourishing with martyrdom. The campaigns to stamp out and to wipe out Christianity, and Christianity was exploding. It's not happening that way today. You see, we can't blame the decline of Christianity on Satan. Oh, yeah, he's contributing, no doubt. We can't blame it on the lost. They're there. We can't blame it on God. Who's left? You see, it comes down to God's people doing their job. If we don't get out there and take this seriously, well, and obviously we haven't, we lose by default. Self-destruction. And yes, you can be a believer and still walk in unbelief. Because I believe in God, all right, you believe in God. But not enough to want His will. I mean, He might ask something of me. I mean, it's scary to think about what God might ask. Why? Doesn't He love you? Doesn't He have your best interest in mind? I mean, what's there to be afraid of? I mean, you ought to be afraid when you don't know God's will. You ought to be afraid when you're not doing God's will. Now, that's something that's really scary. I want to know what God's will is, and I don't want anything else. I'm going to miss out on something if I don't know God's will. We ought to be running to the throne of God, saying, God, show me your will so I can do it, and I don't want to miss out on anything. That's where we ought to be. And if that had been the characteristic of Christendom from the beginning, we wouldn't be where we are today. Anyway, that introduces you to what we'll get in, complete our thoughts on tomorrow night. And then I will introduce you to the arguments that I use to convince the gainsayers, the secularists, the atheists? What arguments do you go into for the atheists? Well, I've debated the atheists. I'll leave you with this story. I was speaking up at the University of North Dakota. Brother Skeving. I think it was up there. I think it was that university. It might have been the one up by Brother Mike Custer. And boy, that was a long time ago. I can't even remember which university it was. But I remember it was up there in North Dakota. And a professor had heard that I was coming up there, and he called me while I was in Fayetteville and said, "Hey, I hear you're coming. You're going to do the seminar. I want you to come, and I'd like you to consider talking to my class." Well, it turns out he's an evolutionist. He teaches evolution. That's his bread and butter, and that's his specialty. I said, "Well, I'll be glad to come and talk to your class." And so that was a Monday when I got there, and we went to class, and we're walking down the hall. He said, "Now, I just want to be honest with you. Everything you have to say today, I'm going to refute and shoot down Wednesday." I said, "Well, that's okay. At least the kids get to hear it once." So I got into the class, and the class started, and it was a big auditorium. It was one of these theater-type auditoriums. And the professor went up and walked into the back, up to the back row corner there. And so I start talking, writing on the chalkboard as fast as I can, talking as fast as I can. I wanted to get the whole outline there as much as I could. The professor came down after class, and he said, "This makes the creation science model credible." That's what I'm going to share with you this week. What makes us credible? What can we say to legitimize our faith in the minds of the secularists? Well, God created everything, so there ought to be a good reason out there. We ought to be able to find it, and there is. But that's the niche that I fit into, and that's the crowd I usually talk to. I'm dealing with the secularists and the atheists, and I'm going to share that with you this week. Amen?